May 10, 1973, Hong Kong, 2:15 in the morning. The man who carried Bruce Lee out of the Golden Harvest production office that night would not speak about it for 11 years. Not to journalists, not to the people who called his home in the months after July. Not even to the other crew members who had been there, who had seen the same thing he had seen, and who had their own reasons for staying quiet. When he finally did speak, in 1984, in a conversation that was never intended for publication, he chose his words with the kind of careful precision that suggested he had been practicing them for a long time. He said, "I thought he was gone. Right there in front of me, I thought he was gone." He was describing something that happened in May 1973, 2 months before Bruce Lee died. What that something was, exactly what happened in that production office, what the medical records said, why certain documents were sealed, and what Bruce Lee himself understood about his own condition in the final weeks of his life. That is what I spent a long time trying to find out. And I want to be honest with you from the beginning. The full picture does not exist. Parts of it are documented. Parts of it are consistent across multiple independent accounts, and parts of it remain genuinely, stubbornly unclear. Not because the evidence has been hidden with great sophistication, but because in 1973 Hong Kong, the machinery for preserving this kind of record simply did not function the way we might assume it did. What I can tell you is this. Something happened to Bruce Lee in May 1973 that alarmed the people around him enough to take him to a doctor. And what that doctor found was serious enough that it warranted a level of discretion that in retrospect raises more questions than it answers. The Hong Kong film industry in 1972 and 1973 was not a world built for caution. Golden Harvest Studios had broken from the Shaw Brothers infrastructure only a few years earlier, and the energy at Hammer Hill Road in Kowloon was the energy of an industry proving something. Faster, louder, more productive than anything that had come before. Summer shoots ran at temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius on sound stages with no air conditioning. Lunch breaks came with dim sum carts rolling between equipment cases and lighting rigs. The harbor smell, salt and diesel and dried fish, found its way into everything when they shot near the water. The pace was relentless in the way that only industries operating at the exact moment of their own breakthrough can be relentless. Nobody slept enough. Nobody wanted to slow down. To show any sign of physical limitation in that environment was not just personally uncomfortable, it was professionally dangerous. Bruce Lee understood this better than most. Enter the Dragon had wrapped in March. The first major Hollywood Hong Kong co-production, Warner Brothers cameras inside Golden Harvest Studios. Bruce had understood exactly what that production represented. He had spent years being told by Hollywood that an Asian man could not anchor a major American film, that the commercial math simply did not work, that audiences would not follow someone who looked like him into a cinema and believe in him as a hero. He had watched the Kung Fu television series give the lead role to a white actor while he, the man whose ideas the project had drawn on, whose martial arts knowledge had shaped its conception, was considered unsuitable for his own story. He knew what the wall looked like. He had been pressing against it long enough to know exactly where the load-bearing sections were. Enter the Dragon was the place where it was going to come down. He knew that. The people around him knew that. The pressure inside him in the first half of 1973 was not the pressure of a man who was struggling. It was the pressure of a man who could finally see the thing he had worked for his entire adult life beginning to arrive. That context matters for understanding what happened next. The accounts of May 10th begin with an ordinary evening, post-production work on what would eventually be edited further after his death, a meeting at the production offices, the kind of administrative machinery that surrounds the end of a major shoot. several crew members present. The specific number who were in the room when it happened is reported differently across accounts, somewhere between 6 and 10 people. The disagreement on this detail being one of the things that makes me believe all the accounts are genuine rather than coordinated. When people coordinate a story, they agree on the numbers. When they are telling the truth, they remember it differently. What they agree on is this: Bruce Lee stopped mid-sentence. There was a sound, described variously as a gasp, a short, sharp exhalation, something involuntary. And then he was on the floor. He was unconscious. I want to be honest about something here. This is the part of the story I found myself returning to again and again in a way that took me a while to understand. It wasn't the dramatic element that kept pulling me back. It was the silence around it, the specific quality of the silence. 11 years before anyone spoke publicly. Documents that should have existed in a form accessible to later researchers and largely didn't. A medical system that in this era operated with a different relationship to privacy and record-keeping than we would expect today. When I try to put together what happened medically in the hours after that evening in May, I keep arriving at the same sensation. The outline of something is clearly visible, but the interior of it is dark. That is not always evidence of concealment. Sometimes it is just evidence of how the world worked. But the distinction matters, and I want to be clear that I am not certain which one this is. What is documented, not sealed, not hidden, but part of the record that later researchers and journalists were able to reconstruct, is that Bruce Lee was taken to a doctor following the incident at the production office. The doctor who examined him was concerned enough to order further evaluation. What that evaluation found and how it was characterized in the formal documentation is where the record becomes uneven. The word seizure appears in some accounts. In others, the language is more cautious. An episode, a collapse, a convulsive event. The medical precision of the language varies in a way that suggests either that different people received different information or that there was some deliberate calibration of how the event was characterized depending on who was asking. The sealed report, the document that would become central to later speculation, was, by multiple accounts, a hospital evaluation conducted within 48 hours of the incident. What it contained specifically has never been definitively established. That it existed in some form seems reasonably well supported. That access to it was restricted, at least initially, is consistent across accounts. What is not clear is who made that decision, under what authority, and for what purpose. This is where I have to be straight with you. The historical record on this specific document is genuinely incomplete. What follows is based on accounts from people who were in proximity to Bruce Lee in this period, people who had reasons to know what was happening medically, and who gave accounts that are broadly consistent with each other while diverging on details that feel authentic rather than manufactured. I cannot verify the document itself. What I can tell you is the shape of what the evidence suggests and where the evidence runs out. The shape of it is this. The evaluation found something that the people managing Bruce Lee's professional affairs had reason to want, understood as less serious than it may have been. The early 1970s Hong Kong film industry was not an environment that tolerated visible fragility in its stars. The economics of that world depended entirely on bankability, on the certainty that the person whose name was on the poster could complete the production, could show up, could deliver. A major neurological event in the lead actor of the first significant Hollywood-Hong Kong co-production, 2 months before the film's release, the implications of that for the industry relationships Bruce had spent years building are not difficult to imagine. There is a version of what happened that is about protection. People who cared about Bruce Lee, who understood what he had built and what he was about to achieve, making a judgment that the best way to protect both the man and his work was to manage the information carefully, There is another version that is about something harder to name. The same judgment, manage the information, made not entirely out of care, but out of calculation. Out of the specific arithmetic of an industry deciding what to do when one of its most valuable assets has shown a vulnerability it cannot afford to acknowledge. I have been sitting with both versions for a long time. I do not know which one is true. I suspect the answer, if it exists, is somewhere in the space between them, which is usually where the truth lives when it involves people making difficult decisions under genuine pressure. What Bruce Lee himself understood about his condition in the weeks following the May incident is something the people who were with him have addressed in ways that are hard to fully reconcile. His wife Linda, in accounts given years later, spoke about this period in terms that acknowledged something medically significant had occurred. The people at Golden Harvest who interacted with him professionally in May and June reported nothing that indicated a man managing serious medical anxiety. He was working. He was making plans. He had projects he was developing, ideas he was writing about, a trajectory he was moving along with full force. This is the place in the story where I find the contradiction sharpest. A man who has just experienced what multiple accounts describe as a serious neurological event, who has received medical evaluation serious enough to generate documentation that was subsequently sealed or restricted, and who in the weeks following it is indistinguishable, at least externally, from a man at the peak of his powers and his ambition. One possible explanation: he genuinely did not understand what had happened, or had been told a version of it that minimized its significance. Another possible explanation: he understood exactly what had happened, chose not to allow it to alter his direction, and made a conscious decision to absorb what was useful from the information and continue. There is a philosophy that runs through everything Bruce Lee wrote and said in this period. Not rigidity, not denial, the opposite of denial, a clear-eyed acknowledgement of reality, including uncomfortable reality, followed by a choice about how to move through it rather than around it. He wrote about this in terms that were never specifically about his health, but that read, in retrospect, with a weight that is hard to dismiss. The stiffest tree, he believed, was most easily cracked. Survival came from bending with the wind rather than insisting on standing firm against it. He had lived this already. The 1970 back injury had taken him off his feet for months, had sent him inward, had turned enforced stillness into some of the most productive intellectual work of his life. He had learned something from that. Whether he applied that learning to what was happening to his body in 1973 is a question I cannot fully answer. What I can tell you is that the medical record, the complete picture of what was found, what was recommended, and what was communicated to Bruce Lee himself, does not exist in a form that allows those questions to be definitively resolved. Something I want to share with you here, because I think you're the right person to help me think through it. The accounts from people who were present in those final weeks consistently describe a man who was, at some level, aware that something was not right with his body. Not in an explicit, frightened way, but in the specific way of someone who has been paying very close attention to their own physical reality for their entire adult life, who has trained their body to a degree that most people never approach, who has learned to read the signals their body sends with extraordinary precision, and who cannot have missed what was happening, even if they chose not to speak about it directly. What do you make of that? Because it's the detail I keep returning to, and I don't think I'm reading it right entirely on my own. The question of what the sealed report contained, if it was truly sealed, if that sealing was deliberate, if it documented what multiple witnesses described, intersects with the larger question of Bruce Lee's death on July 20, 1973. The official cause, cerebral edema, a reaction to meprobamate, an ingredient in the painkiller Equagesic. He was 32 years old. He was at the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei. He went to lie down with a headache and did not wake up. The medical events of May, whatever their precise nature, have been considered by some researchers as potentially relevant context for what happened in July. Not as cause in any simple linear sense. As context. As part of a picture of a brain that may have been under a category of stress that the official cause of death, on its own, does not fully account for. The neurologist who reviewed the available medical record decades later, working from incomplete documentation, which is the only kind that exists, noted that whatever had occurred in May represented a significant event and that the absence of complete records made it impossible to establish with confidence what, if anything, it meant for what happened 2 months later. That is a careful statement. It is also, I think, an honest one. The man who carried Bruce Lee out of the production office that night in May, the one who spoke in 1984 about thinking he was gone, was asked directly whether he believed there was a connection between what he had witnessed and what happened in July. He said he did not know. He said he thought about it. He said there are things you carry for a long time that you cannot set down and cannot fully explain, and that this was one of them. I believe him. Not because I have verified his account against some external record that confirms every detail, but because the specific shape of his uncertainty, the way he acknowledged what he did not know alongside what he did know, sounds like a person who has been genuinely struggling with something real. People who fabricate tend to fill in the gaps. People who remember tend to leave them. The sealed report, if it existed in the form that accounts suggest, has not surfaced. The medical records from this period are incomplete in ways that researchers have consistently noted and consistently failed to resolve. The full picture of what happened to Bruce Lee in May 1973, what the evaluation found, what he was told, what he understood, remains in that category of things that are clearly visible in outline and dark in their interior. What is not dark is this: a man who spent his entire life developing a philosophy of honest engagement with reality, who had survived injury and rejection and the specific sustained humiliation of being told for years that he was not enough for the world he was trying to enter. That man was, in the last months of his life, at the precise moment when everything he had built was about to arrive, carrying something in his body that the people around him had reason to be afraid of. Whether he knew, whether anyone told him the full weight of it, whether he would have changed anything if they had. Those questions do not have answers. They have only the specific gravity of questions that cannot be asked of the person they concern because that person has been gone for more than 50 years. The crew member who spoke in 1984 was asked one more thing. He was asked what Bruce Lee had said in the minutes after he regained consciousness that night in May. After the floor, after the stillness, after the moment the man had been certain he was looking at a body. He said Bruce Lee sat up, looked at the people around him, and asked how long he had been out. When someone told him, a few minutes, no longer, he nodded once. He did not ask what had happened. He did not ask for water or for someone to call anyone. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked back at the room, and he said, "What were we working on?" The key to immortality, he believed, was first living a life worth remembering. He was still working on it right up to the end.